The morning sun cast long shadows across Rodeo Drive as Dr. Kennedy Blake stepped out of her modest Honda Civic, a deliberate choice that would prove more significant than anyone could imagine. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built empires from nothing, though today she wore the uniform of invisibility, a simple white cotton t-shirt, well-fitted jeans, and comfortable Nike sneakers. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and the only jewelry she wore was a simple gold wedding band, a gift from her late grandmother. Kennedy paused before the gleaming storefront of Lux Diamonds Beverly Hills, watching her reflection merge with the display of million-dollar pieces behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to enter a world she had created, yet she felt like a stranger approaching forbidden territory. This wasn't her first unannounced visit to one of her stores, but something about the energy today felt different, charged with an anticipation she couldn't quite name. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors, the familiar scent of expensive leather and subtle perfume enveloped her. The interior gleamed with warm lighting that made every diamond sparkle like captured starlight. But it was the immediate shift in atmosphere that caught her attention. The way conversations seemed to pause, the way eyes tracked her movement with a mixture of curiosity and subtle disdain. Kennedy had built this empire from a single kiosk in Detroit, but today she was just another black woman who didn't fit the Beverly Hills stereotype. She took a deep breath, knowing that what was about to unfold would either validate her faith in her company's values or shatter everything she thought she had built. Either way, the truth was about to emerge, and Dr. Kennedy Blake was ready for whatever came next. Kennedy moved through the showroom with the practiced eye of someone who knew every inch of the space, though she kept her expertise carefully hidden. The store hummed with quiet luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across white marble floors, while security cameras captured every angle with the discreet efficiency she had personally approved. She watched as sales associates glided between customers, their movements choreographed by years of training she had funded. At the engagement ring display, her personal pride, featuring designs she had sketched during late nights in her home office, Kennedy paused to examine a 3-carat solitaire. The piece represented months of collaboration with master craftsmen in Antwerp, but today it felt foreign under the harsh judgment of unfamiliar eyes. Jessica Martinez, 28 years old with perfectly styled brown hair and a smile that seemed programmed for selective activation, stood behind the counter arranging inventory. When Kennedy approached, Jessica's eyes performed a quick assessment, taking in the casual attire, the absence of obvious wealth markers, the skin tone that didn't match the store's typical clientele. The young woman's smile remained dormant as she continued her work, treating Kennedy with the particular brand of invisibility reserved for those deemed unworthy of attention. "Excuse me," Kennedy said softly, her voice carrying the refined tone of private schools and Ivy League education. "I'd love to learn more about this collection." Jessica glanced up briefly, her expression neutral, but her body language speaking volumes. She gestured vaguely toward a different section. "The fashion jewelry is over there," she said, returning to her inventory count. "More in your price range." Kennedy felt the familiar sting, but maintained her composure. She had built her fortune on reading people, understanding market dynamics, and most importantly, recognizing when systems were failing. This interaction was data, and she was collecting every piece of information. From across the showroom, David Sterling emerged from his office like a predator sensing disruption in his territory. At 45, the store manager carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who confused authority with superiority. His eyes locked onto Kennedy with immediate suspicion, taking in details that fed his preconceived notions: the casual dress, the unhurried browsing pattern, the skin color that triggered his deeply buried but actively operational biases. David approached with measured steps, stopping just close enough to Kennedy to establish dominance without appearing overtly confrontational. He exchanged a meaningful glance with Jessica, a silent communication that Kennedy observed with growing fascination. This was her company, her vision, her values supposedly guiding every interaction, yet she was witnessing a masterclass in discrimination disguised as customer service. "Is there something specific you're looking for today?" David asked, his tone carrying the subtle edge of someone who had already decided the answer should be nothing. Kennedy smiled, recognizing the test embedded in the question. "I'm interested in seeing some of your finest pieces," she replied, deliberately using language that would challenge his assumptions. "Perhaps something from your signature collection?" David's eyebrows raised almost imperceptibly. He glanced toward Jessica, who had stopped pretending to work and was now openly watching the interaction. Other customers, predominantly white, obviously wealthy, comfortable in their environment, began to take notice. Kennedy felt the weight of their attention, understanding that she had become a curiosity, a disruption in their carefully maintained world. "Our signature pieces require serious consideration," David said, his words carefully chosen. "Perhaps you'd like to start with something more accessible?" The word hung in the air like a challenge. Kennedy nodded slowly, filing away every detail of this encounter. She was witnessing the erosion of everything she had tried to build, the corruption of values she thought she had institutionalized. But she was also gathering evidence, building a case that would soon reach its inevitable conclusion. The seeds of bias had been planted long before her arrival, growing in the shadows of her success, fed by assumptions and stereotypes she thought she had eliminated. Now, under the bright lights of her own store, surrounded by the fruits of her labor, Dr. Kennedy Blake was about to discover just how deeply those roots had spread. Kennedy approached the diamond necklace display with genuine interest, though every step felt like walking through a minefield of judgment. The centerpiece, a stunning $50,000 creation featuring cascading diamonds in a design she had personally approved 6 months ago, drew her attention. She remembered the late-night conference calls with the Italian designers, the careful selection of each stone, the pride she felt when the finished piece arrived. "I'd like to see this necklace," she said, pointing to the centerpiece with the confidence of someone accustomed to luxury purchases. Jessica's reaction was immediate and telling. She glanced nervously toward David, who had positioned himself nearby like a security guard. "That particular piece requires special handling," Jessica said, her voice carrying a new edge of authority. "We typically need to verify purchasing capability before we remove it from the display." Kennedy felt her pulse quicken, but her expression remained serene. "Of course. What would you need to verify?" David stepped forward, inserting himself into the conversation with practiced authority. "We require a credit check and verification of funds for items over $25,000, he said, though Kennedy knew no such policy existed. She had personally reviewed all customer service protocols, and this requirement was being invented in real time. Around them, other customers continued their shopping experiences with ease. An elderly white woman examined a tennis bracelet worth $30,000 without question. A young couple looked at engagement rings exceeding Kennedy's necklace in price, receiving enthusiastic assistance and no mention of credit checks. Kennedy observed these double standards with the analytical mind that had built her empire. "I'd be happy to provide whatever verification you need," she said, reaching for her purse with deliberate calm. "Actually," David continued, his confidence growing, "given the value of our inventory, we also require 2 forms of identification and a personal reference who can vouch for your circumstances." The word circumstances carried weight beyond its letters. Kennedy understood she was being asked to prove her worthiness, to justify her presence in a space she had created. The absurdity of the situation was almost amusing, but the implications were deeply troubling. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual nature of the interaction. Some customers watched with open curiosity, others with uncomfortable recognition of what was unfolding. Kennedy noticed a young woman discreetly recording with her phone, capturing evidence of discrimination that would soon find its way across social media. "I understand you have policies," Kennedy said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "However, I notice other customers aren't being asked for the same verification. Could you help me understand why my transaction requires additional steps?" David's face flushed slightly, the challenge to his authority triggering a defensive response. "Every customer is treated according to our standard procedures," he said, though his eyes betrayed the lie. "If you're unable to meet our requirements, perhaps you should consider shopping elsewhere." The suggestion hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Kennedy felt the familiar fire that had driven her from poverty to fortune, but she channeled it into strategic thinking. This wasn't just about a necklace or even about her personal dignity. This was about the culture that had grown within her company like a cancer, hidden from her executive oversight but clearly visible to those it targeted. She pulled out her Black American Express card, a piece of metal that carried no spending limit and required an annual fee equal to many people's rent. David examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, as if the card might be counterfeit simply because it belonged to her. "We'll need to call for verification," he announced loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "Credit card fraud is unfortunately common with certain types of customers." Kennedy felt the collective intake of breath from witnesses. The racist implication was no longer subtle. It was broadcast for everyone to hear and judge. She watched David's face, seeing the satisfaction of someone who believed he had successfully intimidated an unwelcome presence. But Kennedy Blake hadn't built a business empire by being intimidated. She had survived boardrooms full of men who underestimated her, negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions, and transformed an industry through sheer determination. This retail manager, in his moment of perceived triumph, was about to learn the difference between authority and power. "Please make your call," she said quietly, her tone carrying an undertone that should have warned him. "Take all the time you need." The phone call stretched into an elaborate performance of humiliation, with David Sterling speaking loudly enough for the entire showroom to hear every detail of his investigation. Kennedy stood with remarkable composure as he questioned her credit limit, her employment status, and her ability to complete such a substantial transaction. Each word was carefully chosen to strip away dignity while maintaining plausible deniability. "Yes, I understand," David spoke into the phone, his voice carrying across the marble floors. "We do need to be careful with these types of situations. Identity theft is unfortunately common." He paused dramatically, covering the mouthpiece. "The bank is having some concerns about unusual activity on your account." Kennedy knew the bank was having no such concerns. Her accounts were meticulously managed, and her credit was pristine. But she also understood that truth was irrelevant to this performance. David was creating a narrative for his audience, painting her as a potential criminal while casting himself as a vigilant protector of the store's integrity. The crowd of onlookers had grown, with customers and staff gathering to witness what was becoming an increasingly public spectacle. Kennedy noticed the mixture of expressions. Some faces showed embarrassment at witnessing such obvious discrimination, others displayed curiosity, and a few showed the cruel satisfaction of watching someone they perceived as other being put in their place. "Ma'am," David said with false courtesy after ending his call, "I'm afraid we're going to need additional documentation before we can proceed. Perhaps you could return when you have proper proof of your circumstances." Kennedy felt the calculated cruelty of the word choice, the way circumstances was deployed like a weapon designed to make her feel small and unwelcome. She looked around the showroom, her showroom, taking in every detail of the space she had designed to be welcoming and inclusive, now transformed into a stage for the very discrimination she had sought to eliminate. "I'm not sure what additional documentation you could need," Kennedy replied, her voice maintaining its educated cadence despite the provocation. "I've provided valid identification and a credit card with no spending limit. Perhaps you could explain what specific policy requires more?" David's confidence peaked as he sensed what he believed was victory within his grasp. "Look, lady," he said, abandoning any pretense of professionalism, "I've been managing luxury retail for 15 years. I know when someone belongs in a store like this and when they don't. People like you usually can't afford the insurance on these pieces, let alone purchase them." The phrase "people like you" landed like a physical blow, its racist implications clear to everyone present. Kennedy felt the collective discomfort of witnesses who recognized they were seeing something ugly and wrong, yet were powerless or unwilling to intervene. When Kennedy stepped forward to examine the necklace display more closely, David moved to block her path. "I'm going to need you to step back from the merchandise," he said, his voice rising with authority. "Store policy prohibits unaccompanied browsing of high-value items." "Unaccompanied?" Kennedy questioned, noting that other customers moved freely throughout the displays without supervision. "Standard security protocol," David replied, though his eyes betrayed the invention. "For customers who present elevated risk factors." The euphemisms were becoming more transparent, each phrase a thin disguise for the prejudice driving his actions. Kennedy realized she had reached a crossroads. She could reveal her identity immediately and end this charade, or she could allow it to continue and document the full extent of the discrimination that apparently thrived within her organization. She chose to gather more evidence. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Kennedy said calmly, "or perhaps someone from corporate who can explain these policies that seem to apply selectively." David's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Lady, I am the supervisor, and trust me, corporate has full confidence in my judgment about who belongs in this store and who doesn't." The irony was almost too perfect to be real. The man was invoking corporate authority to discriminate against the corporation's owner. Kennedy pulled out her phone, ostensibly to check messages, but actually to send a carefully crafted text to her assistant. "Protocol Phoenix activated. Emergency board meeting in 30 minutes. Full documentation needed." As she typed, David's paranoia spiked. "What are you doing?" he demanded, moving closer with aggressive posture. "Are you recording? Are you some kind of blogger trying to create problems?" "I'm simply communicating with my colleagues," Kennedy replied evenly. "Is that against store policy as well?" David's control finally snapped completely. The frustration of dealing with someone who wouldn't be intimidated, combined with his belief that he was protecting the store from an undesirable customer, pushed him beyond any pretense of professionalism. "You need to leave. Now." He stepped into Kennedy's personal space, using his height to intimidate. "I won't have you disrupting our legitimate customers with whatever scam you're trying to pull." Kennedy stood her ground, her calm creating a stark contrast to his agitation. "I haven't disrupted anyone. I've simply tried to make a purchase and asked questions about your policies." "Don't play games with me," David snarled, his mask of civility completely discarded. "I know exactly what you are and what you're trying to do. This is a respectable establishment, and we don't tolerate thieves and troublemakers." The word "thieves" hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Kennedy felt the sharp intake of breath from witnesses, the shift in energy as even those sympathetic to David recognized he had crossed a line. But she remained motionless, processing not just his words but the institutional failure they represented. Then came the moment that would change everything. As Kennedy reached into her purse, perhaps for a business card, perhaps for additional identification, David's paranoia and prejudice culminated in an action that would destroy his career and expose the rot within the company's culture. "Don't you dare reach for anything!" he shouted, and before anyone could react, His hand swept through the air with the force of 15 years of accumulated resentment and prejudice. The slap echoed through the showroom like a gunshot, followed by absolute silence. Kennedy's head snapped to the side from the impact, her cheek immediately showing the red impression of his palm. For a moment, time seemed suspended, as if the entire store was holding its breath. Kennedy slowly turned back to face David, her hand rising to touch her stinging cheek. Her expression remained composed, but something fundamental had shifted in her eyes. Not anger, but a cold calculation that would have terrified David Sterling if he had been intelligent enough to recognize it. "I'll remember this moment," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made several witnesses step back involuntarily. She pulled out her phone again, this time making no effort to hide her actions as she typed, "Emergency protocol now active. Full legal team required. Board meeting moved to 15 minutes. Document everything." The message was ambiguous to observers but devastating in its implications. David Sterling had just physically assaulted the woman who owned not just this store, but the entire corporation that employed him. He had committed career suicide while congratulating himself on protecting company interests. But he didn't know that yet. In his mind, he had successfully handled a disruptive customer. In reality, he had just triggered a chain of events that would expose the discrimination embedded in Kennedy's organization and lead to systematic changes across her entire business empire. The reckoning was about to begin, and Dr. Kennedy Blake was no longer hiding who she was. The aftermath of the slap created a charged atmosphere that seemed to crackle with barely contained energy. David Sterling, still riding the adrenaline of what he perceived as decisive action, straightened his tie and addressed the stunned crowd with misguided confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for that disturbance," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent showroom. "We occasionally deal with individuals who attempt to create problems in our establishment. The situation has been handled." But Kennedy Blake wasn't leaving. She stood in the center of the store like an immovable force, her presence now commanding attention in a way that had nothing to do with her skin color or her clothing. Something had shifted in her bearing. The careful humility was replaced by quiet authority that made several customers unconsciously step closer, drawn by an energy they couldn't identify but instinctively respected. "I'm not going anywhere," Kennedy said simply, her voice carrying clearly across the marble floors. "Not until I speak with the owner of this establishment." David's confidence wavered slightly. Most customers, after being publicly humiliated and physically assaulted, would have fled in embarrassment or anger. This woman's calm persistence was unsettling in ways he couldn't articulate. "Ma'am, I've already explained that I'm the highest authority in this store," David replied, but there was a new edge of uncertainty in his voice. "If you don't leave immediately, I'll have to call security." "Please do," Kennedy replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think we could benefit from having more witnesses to this conversation." The exchange was beginning to attract attention beyond the immediate area. Other customers throughout the 3,000-square-foot showroom were turning to watch, drawn by the unusual nature of the confrontation. Jessica Martinez, who had remained near the engagement ring display, began live streaming on her personal Instagram account, narrating for her followers, "There's some crazy drama happening at work. This woman is claiming she wants to speak to the owner, like she has some kind of right to demand that." The live stream, tagged with Lux Diamond's racism and Beverly Hills drama, began attracting viewers immediately. Comments flooded in, with some viewers expressing outrage at the obvious discrimination, while others supported what they perceived as appropriate security measures. The digital audience was growing by the minute, transforming a local incident into viral content. Mrs. Patricia Thornton, a 70-year-old regular customer who had witnessed the entire encounter, stepped forward with visible distress. "Excuse me, young man," she addressed David with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I've been shopping in this store for over a decade, and I've never seen anything like this behavior. This woman has done nothing wrong, and you struck her in front of all of us." David's face reddened as his actions were publicly criticized by a valued customer. "Mrs. Thornton, I appreciate your concern, but you don't understand the full situation. We have protocols for dealing with difficult customers." "Difficult customers?" Patricia's voice rose with indignation. "This woman asked to see merchandise and you've treated her like a criminal. I'm appalled." Her intervention encouraged others to speak up. A young professional woman stepped forward. "I saw the whole thing. She was nothing but polite, and you were completely out of line." But David had allies as well. Richard Hayes, a real estate developer who prided himself on understanding business, nodded approvingly. David was protecting the store's interests. These people come in here with fake cards and stolen identities all the time. Good for him for not being fooled. The phrase, "these people," sent a ripple of discomfort through the crowd. The battle lines were being drawn not just around the immediate conflict, but around deeper questions of prejudice and justice that made everyone uncomfortable. Kennedy observed the division with analytical interest. She was watching her customer base reveal their true values under pressure, seeing who would stand up for justice and who would retreat into comfortable prejudices. The data was valuable, even as the personal cost was painful. Her phone buzzed with messages from her executive team. Marcus Thompson, her CFO, had seen Jessica's live stream. "Kennedy, this is going viral. Should we intervene?" Sarah Chen, her executive assistant, was more direct. "I have lawyers on standby and PR is preparing statements. Say the word and we shut this down." Kennedy typed back, "Not yet. I need to see how deep this goes." David noticed her texting, and his paranoia spiked again. "Are you calling people?" he demanded, moving closer with renewed aggression. "Are you trying to organize some kind of flash mob? I won't tolerate that kind of disruption." "I'm communicating with my colleagues," Kennedy replied calmly. "Is that illegal now?" "Your colleagues." David's laugh was harsh. "What colleagues? What job could you possibly have that would matter to anyone here?" The question hung in the air with devastating implications. Kennedy smiled for the first time since entering the store, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. David Sterling had just asked the one question that would bring his world crashing down. "You'd be surprised," Kennedy replied softly, "by how much my job matters to this particular establishment." Something in her tone made David pause. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty crept into his expression. He looked around the store, his domain for the past 5 years, as if seeing it through different eyes. The live stream audience had grown to over 50,000 viewers, with shares and comments flooding social media platforms. Lux Diamond's racism was trending regionally, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. What had started as a routine day in Beverly Hills was becoming a national conversation about discrimination and justice. Kennedy's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw it was Marcus Thompson calling from corporate headquarters. She answered with deliberate publicity, making no effort to step away from the crowd. "Marcus," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent showroom. "Yes. I'm at the Beverly Hills location. No, the situation is not resolved. Yes, I think it's time." David Sterling watched this phone conversation with growing unease. There was something about Kennedy's tone, about the way she commanded attention even from unknown callers, that didn't fit his assumptions about who she was supposed to be. "Ma'am," he interrupted, trying to regain control, "I'm going to need you to step outside for your personal phone calls. You're disrupting our business environment." Kennedy looked at him with something approaching pity. "Mr. Sterling," she said, using his name for the first time, "I don't think you understand. I'm not disrupting your business environment. I am the business environment." The words were cryptic, but carried such quiet authority that conversation throughout the showroom ceased entirely. Customers, staff, and social media viewers all sensed that something significant was about to be revealed. though none of them could anticipate the magnitude of what was coming. David Sterling stared at Kennedy Blake, and for the first time since their encounter began, he felt the cold touch of real fear. Something was wrong with his narrative, something fundamental that he couldn't identify but could no longer ignore. The moment of revelation was approaching, and Dr. Kennedy Blake was ready to reclaim not just her dignity, but her entire company. The store's landline began ringing with urgent persistence, cutting through the tense atmosphere like an alarm. David Sterling glanced toward the sound but remained focused on Kennedy, still convinced he was managing a disruptive customer rather than facing his own professional execution. Jessica Martinez looked toward David questioningly. Should she answer? The ringing continued, demanding attention with its shrill insistence. Finally, David nodded curtly, confident that whatever business matter was calling could wait while he finished handling this situation. Jessica lifted the receiver. Lux Diamonds, Beverly Hills, this is Jessica speaking. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and utterly terrifying in its implications. This is Sarah Chen, Executive Assistant to Dr. Kennedy Blake, Chief Executive Officer of Lux Diamonds Corporation. I need to speak with the store manager immediately regarding an emergency situation involving our CEO. Jessica's face drained of color. She looked across the showroom at Kennedy, then at David, then back at the phone in her trembling hand. Could you please repeat that? Dr. Kennedy Blake, the owner and CEO of your company, is currently in your store and has been physically assaulted by your manager. I need to speak with David Sterling immediately. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jessica's live stream caught every moment of her shock, broadcasting her horror to thousands of viewers who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine discrimination incident. David, Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible, you need to take this call. David strode over with irritated confidence, still believing he was being summoned to handle some unrelated business matter. He grabbed the phone with authority. This is David Sterling, store manager. What's the emergency? Sarah Chen's voice was ice-cold professional. Mr. Sterling, you have just physically assaulted Dr. Kennedy Blake, the founder and CEO of Lux Diamonds Corporation. She is standing in your store right now, and you slapped her across the face. I have 47,000 people watching this incident on social media, I have lawyers on standby, and I have the board of directors preparing for an emergency meeting. Would you like to explain to me how you came to assault your own CEO? David Sterling's world imploded in real time. His face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, the terrible recognition of absolute professional and personal destruction. He looked across the showroom at Kennedy, who was watching him with the calm expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. That's not possible, David stammered into the phone, but his voice lacked conviction. Something about Kennedy's bearing, about the way she commanded space despite her casual attire, was finally making sense in the most horrifying way possible. Kennedy walked over slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the store. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing they were in the presence of someone whose authority transcended their understanding. She extended her hand for the phone. I'll take that call now, she said softly. David's hand trembled as he passed the receiver, and in that moment of contact, Kennedy Blake reclaimed not just a phone call, but her entire domain. She spoke with quiet authority. Sarah, yes, it's me. Please initiate Protocol 7 immediately. I want full legal documentation of everything that's occurred here today, and I want the board convened within 15 minutes. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Kennedy Blake stepped fully into her role as CEO, and suddenly everything about the past hour made perfect, devastating sense. Her calm under pressure, her refusal to be intimidated, her strategic gathering of evidence, these weren't the actions of a random customer, but of someone who owned everything David Sterling had thought he was protecting. David Sterling collapsed into a nearby chair, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had spent 15 years building a career in luxury retail, and he had destroyed it all with a single, prejudice-driven decision. But worse than his professional suicide was the knowledge that he had embodied everything wrong with the industry, everything Kennedy Blake had built her company to oppose. Kennedy turned to address the stunned crowd, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you've had to witness this incident. I'm Dr. Kennedy Blake, and I own Lux Diamonds Corporation. What you've seen today represents a fundamental failure of the values I believed we had institutionalized throughout our organization." The live stream audience exploded into chaos, comments flooding in faster than could be read. Lux Diamonds, racism was now trending nationally, but the narrative was shifting rapidly from simple discrimination to corporate accountability and the power of truth revealed. Jessica Martinez, still holding her phone and broadcasting to a live audience, was caught between horror at her own complicity and amazement at the impossible twist. She had been live streaming the discrimination and humiliation of her own company's CEO, narrating the destruction of a woman who could end her career with a single phone call. Mrs. Patricia Thornton stepped forward, her face glowing with vindication and pride. "I knew there was something special about you, dear. The way you carried yourself, the way you refused to be diminished. You have the bearing of someone who builds things rather than tears them down." Kennedy smiled at the older woman, recognizing an ally who had stood up for justice when it mattered most. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. Your support meant more than you know." But David Sterling was not finished. Even in his moment of absolute defeat, prejudice and pride battled within him. He stood shakily, his voice cracking with desperation. "This has to be some kind of mistake. You can't be... look at you." The unfinished sentence contained everything ugly about his worldview. Kennedy studied him with something approaching clinical interest, seeing in his breakdown the institutional biases she had spent years trying to eliminate. "Look at me?" Kennedy repeated quietly. "What exactly do you see, Mr. Sterling? What made you so certain that I didn't belong in a store I built from nothing?" David couldn't answer. The question exposed the racist assumptions that had driven his actions, and he lacked the courage to own them publicly, even in his moment of complete professional destruction. Kennedy's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen. Marcus Thompson, her CFO, calling from the corporate boardroom where executives were gathering for the emergency meeting she had demanded. She answered on speaker, her voice carrying across the silent showroom. "Marcus, I'm here with approximately 50 people and about 60,000 social media viewers. Please brief everyone on the current situation." Marcus's voice filled the store with corporate authority. "Kennedy, the board is assembled, legal is standing by, and PR is managing a rapidly evolving story that's being picked up by major news outlets. We're prepared to implement whatever measures you deem necessary." Kennedy looked around the store, her store, taking in the faces of customers, staff, and social media audience who were all processing the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Discrimination had been exposed, power had been revealed, and justice was about to be served. But first, there would be consequences for those who had chosen prejudice over professionalism, who had forgotten that dignity and respect were not luxuries to be distributed based on appearance or assumption. The reckoning David Sterling had unknowingly triggered was about to reshape everything he thought he understood about power, justice, and the price of prejudice in modern America. Kennedy Blake stood in the center of her showroom, surrounded by witnesses both physical and digital, as the full weight of corporate authority descended upon David Sterling. The live stream audience had grown to over 200,000 viewers, making this not just a personal confrontation, but a public reckoning with discrimination in luxury retail. "Mr. Sterling," Kennedy said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had built an empire through strategic thinking rather than emotional reactions. You asked me earlier about my colleagues and whether my job could possibly matter to this establishment. I think it's time we clarified my role here. David Sterling sat slumped in the chair, his earlier aggression replaced by the hollow recognition of complete professional annihilation. He looked up at Kennedy with the expression of someone watching their entire career burn in real time. Kennedy's phone rang again, this time a conference call from the boardroom where her executive team had assembled. She answered on speaker, ensuring that everyone present could hear what was about to unfold. "Dr. Blake," came the voice of Jennifer Walsh, her chief legal officer, "we have full documentation of today's incident thanks to multiple social media streams and witness statements. The legal implications are extensive: assault, discrimination, violation of company policy, and potential civil rights violations. How would you like us to proceed?" Kennedy looked directly at David as she responded. "Jennifer, I want Mr. Sterling's employment terminated immediately. Full documentation for cause, no severance, and a permanent ban from employment with any company in our corporate family. I also want a complete investigation of hiring practices, training protocols, and management oversight at this location." David Sterling's face crumbled completely. 15 years of career building, destroyed in a single morning by his own prejudice and inability to control his actions. But Kennedy wasn't finished. "Additionally," she continued, "I want Jessica Martinez suspended pending a full review of her role in today's events. Her live stream commentary showed a disturbing level of bias that requires immediate attention." Jessica, who had been documenting her own career suicide in real time, finally stopped recording. The phone dropped from her trembling hands as she realized that her narration of Kennedy's humiliation had been broadcast to hundreds of thousands of viewers who now knew she had been mocking her own CEO. Marcus Thompson's voice came through the speaker. "Kennedy, we're also prepared to issue a public statement acknowledging systemic failures and announcing comprehensive reforms across all locations. The board has approved a $10 million fund for community outreach and bias training." Kennedy nodded, though her focus remained on David Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, you told me earlier that people like me don't belong in stores like this. You were wrong. This store exists because people like me, people who refuse to accept limitations based on others' prejudices, built something from nothing." David finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. "I didn't know. I never meant—" "You didn't mean to get caught," Kennedy corrected firmly. "You meant every word you said, every assumption you made, every barrier you tried to place in front of me. The only thing you didn't mean was for there to be consequences." Mrs. Patricia Thornton, who had remained to witness Kennedy's vindication, stepped forward with quiet dignity. "Dr. Blake, I've shopped in luxury stores for 60 years, and I've never seen anything as powerful as what you've accomplished here today. You've turned a moment of injustice into a lesson in accountability." Kennedy smiled at the older woman, recognizing the courage it had taken to speak up when others remained silent. "Mrs. Thornton, your voice mattered more than you know. You proved that silence isn't the only option when we witness discrimination." The crowd in the store had grown as word spread through Beverly Hills about the dramatic confrontation unfolding at Lux Diamonds. Some came as curious onlookers, others as supporters of Kennedy's cause, and a few as critics who struggled to accept that their assumptions about power and race had been so thoroughly demolished. Security personnel arrived, not to escort Kennedy out, as David had threatened, but to ensure her safety as the situation attracted more attention. They recognized her immediately as their ultimate employer, offering assistance with the deference due to someone who signed their paychecks. Kennedy turned to address the full crowd, both present and digital. "Today's incident represents a failure of the values I believed we had embedded in our corporate culture, but it also represents an opportunity to recommit to genuine equality, to rebuild systems that ensure every customer is treated with dignity, and to prove that accountability is more than just corporate rhetoric." She looked directly into Jessica's phone camera, which was still live streaming despite Jessica's shocked paralysis. "To everyone watching, I want you to know that discrimination still exists, even in spaces we believe we've made safe. But I also want you to know that power, real power, comes from building something meaningful and using that position to create positive change. David Sterling struggled to his feet, desperation driving him to one final, catastrophic attempt at self-justification. "This isn't fair," he said, his voice cracking. "I was protecting the store's interests. I was doing my job." Kennedy's expression hardened with controlled anger. "Your job was to serve customers with respect and professionalism. Your job was to embody the values of a company built on inclusion and excellence. Instead, you chose to judge people by their appearance and treat discrimination as customer service. That was never your job, Mr. Sterling. That was your choice." The final blow came as corporate security arrived to escort David from the premises. He would leave the same way Kennedy had been expected to leave, humiliated and defeated. But unlike Kennedy, David Sterling's departure was earned through his own actions, not imposed by others' prejudices. As David was led away, Kennedy turned to the remaining staff with the authority of someone who had just demonstrated the consequences of failing to uphold her company's values. Let today be remembered not as the day discrimination was exposed, but as the day we recommitted ourselves to treating every person who enters our stores with the dignity they deserve. The reckoning was complete. David Sterling's prejudice had destroyed his career. Jessica Martinez faced suspension and career consequences, and the entire company would undergo systematic reform to prevent future discrimination. But most importantly, Dr. Kennedy Blake had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into institutional change, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is patient, strategic accountability. As the immediate chaos settled and David Sterling was escorted from the building he had thought he controlled, Kennedy Blake found herself at the center of a moment that transcended personal vindication. The live stream audience had swelled to nearly 500,000 viewers, transforming what began as local discrimination into a national conversation about power, prejudice, and the possibility of justice in America. Kennedy looked around the showroom one final time as CEO in crisis mode, taking in the faces of customers, staff, and onlookers who had witnessed something unprecedented. She moved to the central display area, the same space where David Sterling had denied her access to merchandise she had personally selected, and addressed both her immediate and digital audience with the measured tone of someone who understood the weight of this moment. "I want to thank everyone who spoke up today," Kennedy began, her voice carrying clearly across the marble floors. "Mrs. Thornton, the young woman who challenged discrimination when she saw it, and everyone who refused to accept that prejudice was just store policy. Your voices mattered more than you know." She paused, gathering her thoughts as someone who had spent years in boardrooms crafting messages that would shape corporate culture. "I grew up in Detroit, the daughter of a factory worker and a school teacher. I learned early that the world would judge me by my skin color before it judged me by my character or capabilities. But I also learned that those judgments said more about the people making them than they said about me." The crowd was silent, drawn into a story that contextualized not just today's events, but the broader struggle for dignity and recognition that defined so many lives. Kennedy continued with the natural rhythm of someone accustomed to speaking truth to power. "When I built this company, I thought I could eliminate discrimination through policies and training, through careful hiring and clear values statements. Today I learned that institutional change requires constant vigilance because prejudice adapts and hides in places we think we've already cleaned." Kennedy walked slowly through the showroom, touching display cases and examining pieces she had personally approved, seeing them now through the lens of someone who had been denied access to her own creations. "But I also learned something else today. That real power isn't the ability to humiliate others or to make people feel small. Real power is the capacity to create positive change, to build something meaningful that outlasts our individual lives." She turned to face Jessica Martinez, who remained frozen with her phone, still broadcasting to an audience that now understood the full magnitude of what they had witnessed. Jessica, you have a choice to make now. You can learn from this experience and become part of the solution, or you can defend actions that were indefensible. The decision will shape not just your career, but the kind of person you become. Jessica nodded mutely, overwhelmed by the weight of her complicity and the possibility of redemption that Kennedy was offering despite everything that had occurred. Kennedy's attention turned to the broader audience. To everyone watching, I want you to understand something important. Today's incident wasn't an anomaly. It was a window into experiences that happen every day to people who don't have the power to reveal their identity and demand accountability. Every person who has been followed around a store, questioned about their ability to afford merchandise, or treated as a potential criminal simply because of their appearance has lived some version of this story. The truth of her words resonated through the crowd and across social media, where comments flooded in from people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and their gratitude for seeing someone with power use it responsibly. But here's what I want you to remember most, Kennedy continued, her voice gaining strength and conviction. Change doesn't happen through revenge or humiliation. It happens through accountability, through institutional reform, and through the courage to speak up when we see injustice. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when we might be wrong, even when it costs us something personally. Kennedy pulled out her phone and opened the company's social media accounts, broadcasting live across all platforms. Effective immediately, Lux Diamonds Corporation is implementing the Blake Accountability Initiative, comprehensive bias training for all employees, customer advocate positions in every store, and a community fund to support businesses owned by people who face systemic discrimination. We're not just apologizing for today's failure, we're committing to do better tomorrow. The announcement drew applause from the crowd and praise from social media viewers who recognized that true accountability required action beyond mere words. Kennedy had transformed her personal humiliation into corporate reform, proving that power wielded responsibly could create positive change rather than simply settle scores. As the formal announcements concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Kennedy found herself approached by a young black woman who had been among the onlookers. "Dr. Blake," the woman said quietly, "I'm a business student at UCLA. What you did today? It gives me hope that I can build something meaningful too, even when the world tries to tell me I don't belong." Kennedy smiled, recognizing in the young woman's eyes the same determination that had driven her own journey from poverty to power. "You don't need permission to belong," Kennedy replied softly. "You just need the courage to keep building, even when others try to tear down what you've created." The exchange captured the true significance of the day's events. Not the downfall of David Sterling or the viral nature of the confrontation, but the possibility that witnessing justice served might inspire others to pursue their own dreams despite the barriers they faced. Kennedy Blake stood before her audience, both present and digital, with the quiet authority of someone who had just demonstrated the difference between power and justice. The live stream had reached nearly 1 million viewers, making this not just a personal vindication, but a cultural moment that would be remembered and referenced for years to come. "Before you leave today or click away from this stream, I want you to make me a promise," Kennedy said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just transformed humiliation into institutional change. "Promise me that the next time you see someone being treated unfairly, in a store, at work, in any space where dignity should be universal, you won't stay silent." She looked directly into the camera, speaking to hundreds of thousands of viewers who were processing what they had witnessed. "You don't need to be a CEO to have power. You don't need wealth or authority to stand up for what's right. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let discrimination happen in front of you without consequences." Kennedy smiled, and for the first time since entering the store hours earlier, it was a smile of genuine joy rather than strategic patience. Share this story if you believe in accountability. Support businesses that demonstrate real commitment to equality, not just empty corporate statements. And remember, the person you might be tempted to judge based on their appearance or assumptions about their background might just be the person with the power to change everything. She paused for effect, her eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered the perfect lesson in the dangers of prejudice. After all, you never know who's really watching, who's really listening, and who's really in charge. The final words hung in the air like a promise and a warning, a reminder that power came in many forms, and that assumptions based on appearance could prove devastatingly wrong. Dr. Kennedy Blake had entered her own store as an invisible woman and left as a visible force for justice, proving that sometimes the best response to discrimination wasn't immediate retaliation, but patient, strategic accountability. As she walked toward the exit, Kennedy turned back one final time to address both the crowd and the cameras. Dignity isn't negotiable, respect isn't optional, and justice isn't just a business slogan. It's a choice we make every single day, in every interaction, with every person we encounter. Choose wisely.